The president has been on a pardoning spree, and there seems to be some patterns behind those pardons and who he chooses to, whose sentences he's going to commute. And our guest, Sarah Shazy, wrote a piece in The Atlantic called "This is How Kleptocracies Work," because that pattern seems to remind her of various kleptocracies the world over, which she has studied in depth, and she joins us now. What is a kleptocracy for our viewers? Let's start there.
Corruption exists in every society, obviously. The difference is when it becomes not a sort of aberration that individual venal officials indulge in and often get caught and punished, but rather when it becomes what you could think of as the operating system for not just a government, but I would say networks that weave government officials together with business executives and very often out and out criminals. And these networks are out for basically their own enrichment. And they bend the instruments of state, right? The agencies and institutions that have the power of government, they bend those to serve not the people, but the network. That's a kleptocracy. Sorry.
I know. I had this morning as I was preparing, I was trying to say kleptocracy, and democracy is ruining one's ability to pronounce kleptocracy because that T gets right in there, stealing the focus like people do in a kleptocracy. So, what are some of the patterns within Trump's pardoning process that have you a little on guard, I guess, about whether we are headed toward the kinds of kleptocracies that you've studied in other parts of the world?
The instrument of state or the agency that every single kleptocracy I have looked at or lived in has to capture is the justice function. And the reason for that is these networks are held together by a bargain. Money gets distributed within the network, and interestingly, it often flows upwards from subordinates up through the ranks to superiors. So what do the subordinates get in return for their loyalty and often a cut of the take that they're pocketing? What they get is impunity. They get, no legal repercussions. And that is the most important thing that the top of the network has to deliver to those underneath. Therefore, the top of the network has to control the justice function. So that's when I started seeing these pardons, and not just the pardons, but the direct interference by President Trump in, sentencing recommendations and things like that. It just looked, I've lived through this in other countries. I actually lived in Afghanistan for a decade and worked on anti-corruption efforts there. And I watched an incredibly difficult case get ended by a telephone call by President Karzai, who ordered the suspect released, and eventually the charges were dropped against him. This was an open and shut case. There was beautiful evidence. Afghan police had developed the case. They were all scattered and sent to the boonies, basically. And what was really interesting about it, it's kind of similar to Trump's tweets. President Karzai did not hide the fact that he had directly interfered with a perfectly legal judicial proceeding. Rather, he kind of trumpeted it. And that is the event that caused me to understand that this was a system, because it was completely illogical that in the circumstances, President Karzai should want everybody to know that he had, just muscled his way into this process. And that's when I realized, wow, he was sending a message to the other members of the network to say, don't worry, I got your back. The deal is safe with me. And I find that President Trump's actions in the pardons that he has granted, and in the very public way, the tweeting, even after his Attorney General, William Barr, basically told him, would you knock it off? It's making it harder for me to do what you want me to do. President Trump is very interested in broadcasting to the people whose loyalty he wants to secure or cement that he will do, he will basically bend the course of justice of the United States judicial function in their favor.
So we don't have a lot of time. My last question for you is, so how do you stop it? You've been in many countries where this kind of thing has happened. Have you been in any that have successfully thwarted this kind of kleptocracy growth? And if so, or if not, where did they fail? What can we do to fix it?
So what is, it's really difficult once they have established themselves, but what is clear is several different things are needed. A vast public mobilization against corruption in government across the board. It can't be factionalized. It can't be, oh, I'll turn a blind eye on my party or my sect or whatever. There needs to be judicial sanction and there needs to be reform, meaning some people need to go to jail. And there needs to be reform legislation to turn what may have been norms in the past into hard-edged law. And I would say what kleptocratic networks use most effectively to dismantle or disable a broad-based opposition is identity divides. And I've seen it in Lebanon, I've seen it in Romania, I've seen it in Afghanistan, I've seen it in all of these countries where the elites in Nigeria, the elites are working together in these integrated networks. They are sometimes beset by rivalries or whatever, but they very effectively divide up the opposition along deep-seated identity divides. So, if we American citizens wish to get the better of this, we're going to have to overcome all of the cleavages of party, of race, of gender, and even to some extent of our attitudes toward people on the other side of those divides.
Sarah Shays, thank you so much for joining us from so far away. And everyone should check out your article, This Is How Kleptocracies Work. Also your book, Thieves of State. And I know you have an upcoming book called On Corruption in America about more or less this very thing coming out in August. So thank you for joining us on The Damage Report.
An honor. Thanks for having me.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.